Oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. This past summer, the Nova Scotia Health Authority announced publicly that 16 new doctors would be coming to Cape Breton Island. Mr. Speaker, it turned out that that announcement was false. It was fake news, Mr. Speaker. The number is not 16. It was later corrected by Dr. Mike McDonald to be 13. Now we understand it's 11, and some of those doctors have not yet signed contracts compelling them to go to Cape Breton, Mr. Speaker. Both myself and the member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg have raised this issue in recent days. I would like to ask the Premier, what is he doing to ensure that the health information that Cape Bretons are getting is accurate?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable for the question. I want to acknowledge to him the Minister of Health has been travelling across the province, meeting and working with our sister organizations across the province to hear from them directly, continue to build with them to work to ensure that we can bring together all of the health care delivery models across the province, continue to make sure that those Nova Scotians who are looking for access to primary health care in their communities can have access to those.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, none of that matters if Nova Scotians can't trust the information they're getting from this government about what's truly going on in their healthcare system. Cape Bretons were given information that was designed as public relations spin to give them hope, when in fact the information was false. Now they are losing confidence in the information they get from this government about what's truly going on about the number of doctors coming to Cape Breton Island. Mr. Speaker, this is exactly why the Auditor General 3 years ago recommended that the government provide for accurate information and the efficient use and collection of information about surgical wait times and other parts of our health care system. That is 3 years ago, and I'll table that Auditor General's report and ask the Premier why his government has failed to act on this important recommendation from the Auditor General.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank again the Honourable for the question. I want to again thank our sister organizations continuing to work to make sure that we recruit healthcare providers across the province. We've invested in the current budget. There's for 70 collaborative care units that will bring together healthcare providers of all disciplines to ensure that the primary care focus in communities across the province is being met. We know there are pockets in the province where there are real challenges. We want to thank those communities who continue to work with us and with the Minister, with the Health Authority, and we'll continue to make sure that we make every effort to ensure that those healthcare teams are in place as quickly as possible.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, 100,000 Nova Scotians today go through their daily lives without a family doctor. They are crying out for more family doctors so they can get the family health care that they need. The least they should expect from this government is to be given truthful information about the number of family doctors that are out there. But they are not getting that truthful information, Mr. Speaker. That is why the Auditor General recommended that a system be put in place that is independent and accurate so we can get the truth about what's going on with family doctors in this province. So I'd like to ask the Premier now, in light of the heightened crisis in this area, will he agree to implement the Auditor General's recommendations to make sure we get independent, verified information on the state of our healthcare system and make it public?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to again thank the Honourable for the question. He would know in this budget there's an additional 10 resident seats for Canadian-trained physicians. There will be another 10 for foreign-trained physicians to come into our province to get Canadian competency. That will bring our discipline up to 56 doctors trained annually in our province, continuing to work towards a long-term solution for what has been a decade-building problem in this province under successive governments. It's not unique to Nova Scotia. It is something that's a phenomenon that's happening across the country. We're seeing it, and what we're putting in place, though, are long-term strategic investments that will provide us with a long-term supply of healthcare providers.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, earlier this year, the government sent out a request for supplier qualifications for P3 advisory services related to the QE2 redevelopment project. And this is a major concern in light of the fact that the province, having followed a P3 model in educational infrastructure, has recently paid $216 million to buy back 37 schools approved under a previous Liberal P3 scheme. So I think it is incumbent on the Premier to answer the question. Given our province's terrible experience with P3s in education, why does he think we should even consider at all reopening that door at this time?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are looking at all options. How do we ensure we provide the infrastructure that Nova Scotians want and deserve in their communities? And this will be one of the options that we'll explore.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier has often expressed the view that it is prudent stewardship of the province's resources to examine a whole range of alternatives. But I wish to ask him this question. After all the work on healthcare infrastructure that has been delayed in the last 4 years in order to save money, why in the world would he now consider turning all this public money over to private developers?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the Honourable for the question and encourage him to go look at the amount of investments that have been made across the province in healthcare infrastructure to ensure that we continue to make the transition of the facilities that we have to make sure that not only do we have the bricks and mortars, but we have the equipment inside of them, provide the services that Nova Scotians have come to expect. We'll continue to work with those. We'll continue to work with those communities and those Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, to make sure that that infrastructure is in place. And we'll look at all options and how we can best do that with the precious tax dollars they have. The honourable member would know the government that he was part of also entered into a P3 arrangement on other pieces of infrastructure. We have not made a commitment to that, but I think it's the only responsible thing to do is look at all the options about how we build these facilities.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, it was painful for the people of the province to hear the report of the Auditor General on P3 schools with its wholesale condemnation and rebuke of the project, and to know, as we heard it, that it was too late now, that these decisions were all in the past and the money had all been spent. So I ask the Premier if he'll commit himself today to establishing an independent review under the Auditor General before any final decision is made on whether or not to redevelop the QE2 on a P3 model.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, here's the review I can give the honourable member. Not a single community is asked to return the school that was built under a P3 model.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, over 100,000 Nova Scotians today live without a family doctor. Now we find out that the existing doctors, Mr. Speaker, are feeling burnt out, overextended, disengaged, and feeling ineffective in their jobs. A recent survey by Doctors Nova Scotia of the doctors of the province shows 70% of them describe their work life as using those words, Mr. Speaker. And the reason they give is the feeling that they are constantly subject to administrative hassles, billing problems, and constraints on their ability to operate as doctors without undue influence from the health authority, Mr. Speaker. I would like to ask the Premier, why is the government making it harder for our existing doctors to live and work in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the honourable member for the question. As he would know, healthcare providers across the province, physicians, nurse practitioners, dietitians, physiotherapists have all said they wanted to work in a collaborative environment. This budget actually provides an opportunity for that, Mr. Speaker. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, we've said that a physician who wants to practice this province can practice wherever he or she wishes to practice. That opportunity is there for them, and we'll continue to work with all of our providers to provide a complement of ways that they can provide services to Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I guess that 70% of the doctors in this province are wrong, and the Premier is the only one that's right when it comes to their work satisfaction here in the province of Nova Scotia. It is not lost. It is.
Order, please. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition has the floor.
It's hard to ask questions in this House, Mr. Speaker, when the Premier and the NDP are being so negative all the time.
Don't roll your eyes more than you have to.
Mr. Speaker, it is not lost on the people of Nova Scotia that this is the same Premier that promised every one of them would have a family doctor if he was elected as their Premier. Now we have 100,000 people without a doctor, and 70% of the doctors that we do have report that they are overextended and that there is too much control on their autonomy and ability to practice as a doctor, Mr. Speaker. They specifically point to their deteriorating relationship with the Nova Scotia Health Authority. So I will ask the Premier, why has the relationship between our doctors and the health authority deteriorated so badly?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At any time, Mr. Speaker, when transition and change happens in an organization, there are always a period of time where those partnerships need to be rebuilt. Mr. Speaker, we know that in our first mandate, we made substantial change in terms of the administration and delivery of healthcare in this province, tearing down barriers, ensuring that we have one health authority to provide services across the province. We know there has been some work that has to be done and will continue to be done in terms of to work with our organization so that everyone feels part of that. We've heard from physicians who have felt that their voice had not been heard. The Minister of Health has been engaging with them. We're hearing from physicians across the province talking about that. We want to continue to bring them to the table to make sure that their views are being heard, and we'll continue to work with all of our partners to ensure that we provide primary health care in communities across this province.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, since the spring of 2015, wait times for community-based adult mental health services at the Cape Breton Regional Hospital have more than doubled. Back then, 90% of those seeking treatment were seen within 203 days. Now, it takes 425. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Minister of Health, how many days does he think it is acceptable for people in industrial Cape Breton to wait for mental health treatment?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member ops for asking this, again, a very important question. I think it's no secret, Mr. Speaker. I think every member in this legislature, and indeed all Nova Scotians, recognize the importance of providing mental health services to Nova Scotians in a timely fashion. That's why, again, Mr. Speaker, the Health Authority continues to recruit to fill positions that are currently vacant in that region, Cape Breton area, Mr. Speaker. They're doing their best to find the qualified personnel to provide those services in that community. But in addition, Mr. Speaker, for all Nova Scotians look for mental health services, we've made significant investments in the budget tabled earlier this week. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
On Tuesday, Mr. Speaker, the Finance Minister said that $3.2 million budgeted for mental health would help to provide additional support for Cape Breton. I've been hearing from many people on the island that folks aren't sure what to expect from this additional support. In order to see whether or not there have been an improvement, we need to know where we're starting and where we'd like to go. So I think it's reasonable, Mr. Speaker, to ask the Minister, have any targets been set to reduce wait times and to improve the access to community-based mental health services in Cape Breton?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite again for raising this issue. Although each time the question is raised, it's about the people of Cape Breton, Mr. Speaker, and I agree that the people of Cape Breton are very important, but indeed, Mr. Speaker, as a government, we're responsible for providing services for all Nova Scotians. So when we're
Order,
working,
please. The Honourable Minister of Health.
So, Mr. Speaker, the investments that we're making in mental health services are indeed for the people of Cape Breton, but, Mr. Speaker, they're also for all Nova Scotians. We're investing, Mr. Speaker, to expand the mental health crisis services, Mr. Speaker, $1.6 million, Mr. Speaker, to go to those services, Mr. Speaker. We're centralizing the intake, Mr. Speaker, to speed up the delivery of services so that a single point of entry, Mr. Speaker, in a healthcare system to ensure people that are struggling or need supports here, Mr. Speaker, can get navigated and directed to the right services at the right time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, at Public Accounts, the Deputy Minister of Education confirmed what parents and guardians and teachers in this province have been saying for quite some time, that there are not enough teaching and program assistants to support students with diverse needs. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Education is standing up and proclaiming that the pre-primary program is inclusive and safe for all 4-year-olds in Nova Scotia. My question is this, Mr. Speaker. If we don't have enough supports, as was acknowledged by the Deputy Minister of Education, how can we assure parents and guardians of 4-year-olds with diverse needs that they will be safe in the pre-primary program?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I do appreciate the question, and we do actually face challenges. In light of the fact that we have increased the number of TAs in the system, we still recognize that it's not keeping up with the need of a diverse student body in the P-12 system, Mr. Speaker. That tells me that there are systemic challenges that we need to overcome. One of those major challenges, of course, is the model of inclusion that we have implemented in this province and has been around for 20 years. We are taking it upon ourselves to review that model so that we can have a transformative impact on our classrooms and how they operate, so that it just isn't an issue of hiring more teachers to keep up with a need that is very difficult to keep up with from a resource perspective, but changing the system so it's better serving all students.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Mr. Speaker, families of children with diverse needs are feeling vulnerable. They were cautiously optimistic, Mr. Speaker, when the Inclusion Commission was announced, then understandably felt let down when this government rolled out the pre-primary program before one single recommendation has been made by the Inclusion Commission. This rushed rollout, Mr. Speaker, sends a message that students with extra needs do not matter. My question is this, Mr. Speaker: is the minister so determined to push through with pre-primary while the needs of our most vulnerable students go unaddressed?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In fact, pre-primary is part of the solution to the challenges that face our teachers in the classroom, Mr. Speaker. And the reason why, and the research demonstrates this, is that we're actually able to screen at an earlier age before these students enter into the academic learning environment for special needs.
The Honourable Minister of Education has the floor.
We're actually able to...
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We're actually able to screen at an earlier age for special needs, for learning disabilities. That'll help us better prepare for these children as they enter the academic learning environment. We are basing this model, Mr. Speaker, on the early childhood centres that this government and the previous government have implemented in the province, models of inclusive early learning that have actually proved to be very successful, for which we have evaluated and received positive feedback from teachers and the educators that are participating in it, Mr. Speaker. I want that member to have a broader perspective and understand that early learning is part of the solution to challenges we face in our education system.
Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Justice. Yesterday, I asked the Minister of Justice how he intended to consult with Nova Scotians about the many issues surrounding the legalization of marijuana. His answer in the House was, "Stay tuned." But later that evening, he told reporters that face-to-face public consultations were not going to be in his plans, and I can table that, Mr. Speaker. My question is, Mr. Speaker, will the minister commit to holding face-to-face consultations with Nova Scotians as they so deserve, just like this Liberal government did when they held meetings regarding highway twinning and taxes?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from my colleague. What I spoke about yesterday, Mr. Speaker, was engaging Nova Scotians through an online opportunity. Every Nova Scotian will have the opportunity for input. We will reach out.
Order, please. Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
We will reach out, Mr. Speaker, to stakeholders to hear from them on the issues that are important to all Nova Scotians. We believe that platform, Mr. Speaker, is the best medium, given the time pressures that the federal government has identified, to achieve our objective.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Mr. Speaker, I realize the time pressure. That's why we were saying this should have started a long time ago. Earlier today, at the Human Resource Committee, George McLellan was appointed chair of the Nova Scotia Liquor Commission Board. He is known for helping government navigate through difficult situations as the amalgamation of the health authorities and ending the film tax credit. My question is Mr. McLellan's appointment a signal from this government that they've already decided to retail marijuana at the NSLC before any kind of consultations happen with stakeholders?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me first acknowledge, as my colleague has, that Mr. McLellan has demonstrated his skill sets across government, Mr. Speaker. But let me also advise my colleague, Mr. Speaker, that no decisions have been made on the retail model, the age or consumption of any of these requirements, Mr. Speaker. We continue to engage our provincial colleagues We continue to be informed by the work that other provinces have done. We continue to be informed by the work that Justice staff have committed to this file, and we will continue, Mr. Speaker, with those efforts in mind to provide the best services to Nova Scotians.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Justice. Speak Up, an action plan to address bullying and cyberbullying, says that this Liberal government will organize and deliver an annual conference on bullying, and I can table that. The conference was intended to promote awareness of issues such as homophobia, sexual violence, poverty, race, disabilities, and mental health. A FOIA pop request from the PC caucus shows that the last conference was held in 2013, and that was tabled as well. My question to the minister: has the minister abandoned the Liberal commitment to hold a bullying conference each year, which is desperately needed in this province?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I can say to my colleague is that we will be introducing legislation around cyberbullying in the very near future, that we will seek all opportunities, Mr. Speaker, to provide supports to Nova Scotians, youth and adults, so they can overcome the issues and challenges faced by bullying in today's society.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Mr. Speaker, a promise that was made in 2013. It's 2017. Once again, we're waiting years upon years. Nova Scotia has not had an anti-cyberbullying since last December. 2015, when the legislation was struck down by the Supreme Court. Despite that, the government has gone back on its commitment, again, to hold an annual conference. This government has denied the experts and the stakeholders that want to speak up an opportunity to meet and discuss all the measures that could be taken to protect kids until there is a valid law. Why has the government washed its hands of this responsibility when it comes to protecting our young people from cyberbullying?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it's important to recognize the cyberbullying unit, Mr. Speaker, that was brought in previously, Mr. Speaker, and continue to do their work to identify and address the areas that my colleague has identified. How important it is to reach out to subject matter experts and seek their input, Mr. Speaker. How important it is to reach out to victims and seek their input. Those are the steps we're taking, Mr. Speaker. Those are the steps that the CyberScan unit continues to make. We will introduce legislation, Mr. Speaker, in the near future so that we can continue to engage Nova Scotians to resolve and address this issue that is having such a negative impact on our province.
The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Natural Resources. Last October, her predecessor was asked here in this House whether Parks Canada had any concerns about a proposed clear-cut next to Kejimkujik National Park. He said at the time, and I have the Hansard record here, that his department was in constant communication with Parks Canada and that they had no concerns about the proposed harvest. However, since then, a Parks Canada briefing note has surfaced in the media indicating that DNR did not inform Parks Canada about the clear cut, and in fact, they do have, and they did have, a number of concerns about the harvest. So, Mr. Speaker, the question is, would the minister like to stand and clarify why her department kept Parks Canada in the dark about the proposed clear cut?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the honourable member for the question opposite. I'm not familiar. I've heard certainly about that situation with the clear cut next to Kejimkujik Park last year, but I'm not aware of the report that she has, but I certainly will look into that. I would like to inform all members of this House that all clear cuts or any cuts in Nova Scotia, any kind of harvest, whether it's partial or total harvests, are very well planned by the department before they take place. Thank you.
The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, being forthright about forestry policy has been a challenge for this government. Last fall, they walked away from the natural resources strategy, which was informed both by science and by consultation with thousands of Nova Scotians, after saying the province was on track to meet the strategy's targets. More recently, during the spring election, the member for Halifax Citadel Sable Island, now the Minister for Advanced Education and Labour, placed an ad in the Coast saying that the Liberal government froze clear-cutting on Crown land. land. As we heard when the Premier tried to table a petition against a clear cut on Crown land in Annapolis County earlier this week, this is clearly not the case. So I ask the Minister, why has the government repeatedly misled Nova Scotians about the plans for our province's forest?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the honourable member for the question. I'd like to clarify something that I think is extremely important, is that we have been following recommendations of the report. I'm happy to report that the department has already followed almost 91 recommendations, and as of this morning, the numbers on the western area clear cuts are 53%. We are almost to the point that the strategy recommends.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, this question is for the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, the Department of Health is responsible to monitor the health system performance. Since the centralization to one central health authority, the wait times for many services have worsened, including mental health, both outpatient counselling services and inpatient acute care beds. Mr. Speaker, I have asked the leadership team for mental health recently of the Health Authority for a plan to address the current problems. I've asked them to share their vision, timelines, and expected outcomes, and I was told they have no plan. Mr. Speaker, it has been 3 years since this leadership team has been put in place. The question is, when will the Department of Health do its job and hold the leadership team of the Health Authority to task for the job they've been hired to do?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite again for the question. Again, Mr. Speaker, the area of service under question here, the mental health services being provided to all Nova Scotians, clearly is an area of concern and priority for all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. I believe all members of the Legislature and certainly of the government as well. That's why, Mr. Speaker, in the budget that was just tabled, we continue to invest more and expand our investments in providing community-based services, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Providing community-based clinicians, Mr. Speaker, to help us address these very issues in communities. I believe about 73 people, clinicians, providing health services that we've budgeted across the province, and that's on top of investments that are being made in our education system to expand Schools Plus and provide additional clinicians and supports in those areas in our communities, Mr. Speaker. We're really putting resources in as part of the plan to get these services out to the people where and when they need them.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, it's been 3 years since the Health Authority has been formed, the Central, and we have one central board and leadership team. The government stated, quote, "The change will result in an enhanced patient care and safety and more timely and consistent access to care." This has been a failure. One of the benefits of centralization should be a more coordinated, organized approach. In the past, Mr. Speaker, the teams leading our health systems used a clinical services health plan. This plan would lay out a framework for clinical services across the province. Our health authority has no plan. It's been 3 years. This lack of planning and accountability is a large contributing factor to poor health service outcomes. Question: will the Department of Health take your responsibility to govern the Health Authority seriously and hold them accountable to provide a clinical health services plan so that we can have measured health outcomes?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I can assure yourself and the member opposite, Mr. Speaker, that indeed I personally and this government do take seriously, as do the members and the staff within the Nova Scotia Health Authority, our frontline care providers, to provide the services of health care to the people of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, in terms of the planning and the ability to provide services across the province, there are lots of examples, Mr. Speaker, where individuals are seeing improvements in the wait times, Mr. Speaker. We're seeing the ability to spread like we've never had before, providing MRI services.
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Whether they're providing services such as surgeries or MRI scans, Mr. Speaker, the ability to see the wait lists and for physicians making referrals to refer to those communities with the least amount of wait time, distributing that across the province, Mr. Speaker. This is what we talked about, the benefit of having a single health authority. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister for African Nova Scotia Affairs. Residents at the Minister's announcement yesterday around land title have questions that went unanswered. Without having legal title to land that has been in a family for generations means not having the financial stability that being a landowner can provide. Some residents, like Evangeline Downey, want to pick their own lawyers to be sure their interests are being protected. And I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. Families in African Nova Scotia communities have been waiting for decades to have this issue settled. Unfortunately, the Minister was not able to provide some detail they wanted yesterday. My question to the Minister, what experts did the Minister consult with, and how did he arrive at the model he unveiled yesterday?
The Honourable Minister responsible for African Nova Scotian Affairs.
Thank you very much for the question. Nova Scotia Legal Aid Commission is partnering with the Nova Scotia Justice and to provide legal services and to have those conversations.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, instead of answering questions from community members, the Minister of Agriculture promised a meeting somewhere down the road. Residents want to see action after years of talking. My question to the Minister, will the Minister reveal today when and where the consultations with community members will begin?
The Honourable Minister for African Nova Scotian Affairs.
Thank you very much for that question. Let me tell you, first of all, that issue, this is not a joke, because that issue has been ignored by several governments over successive years. An issue that the community has dealt with and I've dealt with. So let me tell you, we are consulting with community and we will get it done right. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tuesday, I asked the Minister of Education about the school psychologist promised to Cape Bretoners after the horrific, horrible tragedies faced by families. The Minister made it clear that it was the school board who was in control of what funds were and were not spent on services for students. The Minister said he did not understand the question, but it's very simple, Mr. Speaker. The budget for these mental health professionals did not change, and the government gave no directive to the cash-strapped school board. The government is taking a pretty casual approach to the issues that are too serious to treat in such a manner. So my question to the Minister, will the Minister ensure there is new additional funding and give the school board a directive to spend it on psychologists?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In response to an incredible tragedy in the communities of Cape Breton, a tragedy that I know all of us can empathize and sympathize with, we did our best to be responsive and thoughtful. We did send Dr. Stan Kuchar, a youth psychiatrist of national renown and credibility, to the area to assist the community and family members to the best of his ability and to provide recommendations to us and the board, which did include for the board to reinstate positions for guidance counseling and for social workers. Mr. Speaker, the board indicated to us that they did need funding to do that, and we did oblige and follow through on the recommendations that were made to us.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
So I guess the money wasn't new money, Mr. Speaker, as they claimed it was, because those positions were already in place and had to be cut because they didn't have enough funding in their budget to make sure that those positions stayed. Mr. Speaker, it's unfair. While Nova Scotians understand the school board's authority, this is another situation where the provincial government remains hands-off while making other times taking a very direct control. This is one of the times Nova Scotians expect the government to come through with more funding and programming to help individuals. We need a government to make this mental health a priority and provide students with the services they need. And we know that Mr. Kuchar made some recommendations. We hope they get under control, Mr. Speaker. So can the Minister guarantee Nova Scotians that each school board has been provided additional funding in this budget that is specific to mental health services?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and I do want to clarify the record. There have been no reductions to funding for special needs or student psychologists. I can table the budgetary documentation for that, Mr. Speaker. Of course, this is a priority for us. And these moments of personal and community tragedy and suffering should be moments that unite us all in this legislature and provide us on perspective of what's important in each of our communities, Mr. Speaker. And I fail to understand how politicizing this issue, which mental health experts say...
Order, please. Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Which, Mr. Speaker, mental health experts say...
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, which health experts claim can inflame these situations and impact the decisions of other young, vulnerable people. This is not about me wanting to not answer questions in this House. I will always do that. But we have to allow...
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Education.
But, Mr. Speaker, I think situations like this need to call upon the better parts of our nature. This is the first time that member and the member from Lewisburg have actually brought this matter to my attention. They never even took the time to talk to me in the summer.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The lack of attention to environmental concerns in the budget and speech from the throne was frustrating but not surprising. After all, this government has shown no interest in holding consultations to give Nova Scotians a greater say on environmental issues that impact their communities, like herbicide spraying, quarry expansions, Alton gas, or Northern Pulp's failing emissions tests. Nor have they actually shown any interest in environmental racism or dealt with the biggest challenge of our time, climate change. So my question, Mr. Speaker, for the Minister of the Environment is this. Can he please tell us why addressing environmental issues and climate change is not a priority for this government?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very proud to serve with this government who has stood up for the environment. We have a very ambitious legislative agenda before us. We have a cap-and-trade legislation that I look forward for the members opposite support. We also have a Coastal Protection Act that we'll be bringing to the House in this mandate, as well as a Biodiversity Act. And I can't remember the last time a government has come in with an agenda like that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, unfortunately, the member was not around when the NDP introduced their environmental changes in this House, which were very progressive. Mr. Speaker, there's been a revolving door of environment ministers since this government took office. 4 ministers in 4 years, with each departing minister passing on their rubber stamp to the successor. Time and again, we've seen environment ministers pass off their responsibility to the department staff or respond to frustrated citizens by regurgitating the phrase, "We're just a regulatory body." So I ask the current minister, is it acceptable that while other governments are making climate change a priority and setting new targets for a more sustainable future for their citizens, this government is still busy trying to decide which is worse for the environment, burning tires or coal?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I know the member references that we are a regulator, which is indeed the truth, but we also are looking at climate change reductions, and we still continue to lead the country in reductions by 30%. In terms of the last government...
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
You can yell NDP all you want, but what you didn't do is
Order,
look at the...
please. I'd like to remind the Honourable Minister not to refer to members opposite directly. The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
The members opposite stood by while effluent continued to go into Boat Harbour, which is a historical injustice that happened in this province for 4 years. The prior government extended it to 2030. This government will keep our commitment to the First Nations communities.
The Honourable Member for Inverness. Order, please. Order, please. The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Transportation. The big topic of conversation, the hot topic of conversation this summer in the Strait area was the delays of the Canso Causeway. Now, we know that the province is responsible for the swing bridge. It certainly affected motorist traffic, but it also affected boat traffic. In fact, the Coast Guard had to put out they issued notice 12 times in June and July where boats could not cross because the bridge could not open. at those times. And since then, there have actually been spans of time that lasted 2 to 3 days where the bridge could not be swung. Mr. Speaker, motorists have been affected. The boating, commercial boat traffic has been affected. Can the minister provide an update of some improvement for this for the swing bridge so that people know that this is going to be improved?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for the question. The care and control of that facility recently transferred from the federal government to the provincial government, and we spent a pile of money and very, very grateful for the patience of the people of the province while we had a detour around the existing swing bridge for some length of time until we could rebuild that facility. It's been upgraded. There are obviously some bugs that need to be worked out, and we have a special team of people who have been assigned to that to investigate and minimize those delays. So we apologize for the delays, but we're very grateful for the patience that people have shown.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, people are losing their patience, and it is time that something be done about this. This is important for our economy. We think about this doesn't only affect the island of Cape Breton, it affects the province of Newfoundland. Most of the truck traffic that's going through, a great deal of it is going to Newfoundland. So, Mr. Speaker, a big problem. We need something more on this, and I know the minister will work at it. But we do hope to hear more about this before the end of this sitting, a concrete plan for improvement. My next question is the rotary. The rotary gets clogged up when the bridge is open or stuck open. And, Mr. Speaker, has the minister given any consideration to the idea posed of perhaps adding a lane where necessary of the routes that are entering into the rotary to keep the rotary clear so that traffic that's not intending to cross can get through and make it to its destination, whether it's Port Hawkesbury, Waikagama, or Inverness?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Again, I thank the member opposite for the question, and those are very valid observations. The reality is, in Nova Scotia, Cape Breton is an island, and we have a causeway that gets to it, and we have a great sea channel that has to be kept open there too. So we need to find the right compromise to enable that to occur. Out of the realization that these delays that were cropping up after we put the new system in place, then the second problem with the wait times showed up, and we're actively looking at ways to alleviate that by diverting some of the traffic around the area there.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Community Services. Tuesday, a former colleague of mine was on CBC Information Morning talking about the fact that she has become the de facto outreach worker in Shelburne for homeless men. This senior safety coordinator states one of her biggest challenges is that Nova Scotia Department of Community Services has no outreach workers in the county of Shelburne to help with homelessness. While Shelburne has many resources, there are no facilities, shelters, or organizations that focus on hopeless men. My question to the minister is, can the Minister of Community Services please tell the homeless men of Shelburne what plans she has to address homelessness in that area?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question, and I do want to acknowledge that housing affordability and having appropriate housing is a challenge in many areas across this province. It is a challenge in Shelburne, and homelessness looks different in rural areas than it does here in Metro. I do want to assure the honourable member that the Western Region Housing Authority has been working closely with the other members of the Shelburne and Area County Housing Coalition to identify some challenges and solutions, and I do want to let her know that if she's aware of cases where people are not being appropriately housed, we would like to know where they are. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank you for that response. Until my election to this chamber, I was the senior safety officer in Queens County and know firsthand the personal tragedies that exist in Queens County. Sadly, I do believe that senior safety coordinators whose job is to work with seniors should not be focusing on the work that is not being done by community services. During my time, I discovered a man in his late 50s who lost his home to foreclosure. He was forced to leave his home in the middle of winter, and this gentleman was a paraplegic. Many calls to housing resulted in the response, "We simply do not have enough affordable, accessible housing." Can the minister please tell me her plan to address the need for affordable, accessible housing for those who so need a proper roof over their head in Queen Shelburne?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And in fact, last year we were able to invest $75 million to make sure that we, in fact, do have affordable and safe housing throughout this province, Mr. Speaker. There is no doubt there is a shift in our caseload. What has happened is, in the past, we had a lot of family units in social housing. Now we are seeing a need for single units. So as part of transformation, the work we're doing with Housing Nova Scotia and with CMHC, we are in fact moving to make sure that we have more units for single adults. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Health and Wellness. Mr. Speaker, it's been brought to our attention that 11 nursing positions at the Cape Breton Regional Hospital's emergency room have been vacant. To fill those positions over the summer, the Health Authority has been using nurses from rural part of Cape Breton, New Waterford, Glace Bay, and the Northside General. But we were told that those nursing positions would go back after the summer and closures were done. This leaves those areas which are already short-staffed, Mr. Speaker, worse off. So my question to the Minister, why is the Minister taking staff from already under-serviced areas and not hiring new nurses? And when will these new nurses be in place?
Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the member's question. Pleased to say that I was down in that area in Sydney earlier this summer, and it was a great opportunity to see the facility, to talk to the nurses on the floor, as well as the other healthcare providers. But, Mr. Speaker, I also took the opportunity during that visit to meet with the nursing students at Cape Breton University, Mr. Speaker. The large number of students that came in for a meeting even before classes started had the opportunity to hear from them firsthand with their plans and intentions and their desire to come in and work within their community, Mr. Speaker. So again, we continue to graduate nurses, hire those nurses when we can, when they're available, Mr. Speaker. That recruitment effort continues ongoing, and I think there's a great crop coming out of CBU in the very near future. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Mr. Speaker, in the past, the nursing students from CBU have all been offered jobs to work in the Cape Breton Health Authority. The last couple of years, that hasn't been the case. As back when my daughter went through there, they were told that all of them wouldn't be offered nursing positions. The Nurses Union has told us that under the new hiring program, it takes at least 78 days to fill a nursing vacancy. The Health Authority tells us the closures are due to a lack of nurses or doctors in our emergency rooms. If we're not filling these positions, it appears those living in rural Cape Breton that this government is looking for an argument to close our rural emergency rooms. So my question to the ministers, will the minister give Cape Bretoners some clarity and tell them, is he using staff shortages at the regional hospital to make a case for closing emergency rooms in New Waterford, Glace Bay, or the Northside General? Yes or no?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can assure the member opposite that is not the case at all, Mr. Speaker. The situation, the staffing situation, Mr. Speaker, and the availability of nurses to hire as part of the recruitment process, those vacancies that are there are posted, Mr. Speaker, and as the Health Authority continues to do that recruitment, as I'd indicated, much of the recruitment for new positions comes in line with the graduating classes out of these programs, Mr. Speaker. And as I said, the vast majority of those nursing students that graduate, not just from CBU, but from St. FX, from the Dalhousie program in Yarmouth, these nursing students, when they graduate, do get hired, and most of them do choose to stay here in Nova Scotia. So we'll continue to do those recruitments, Mr. Speaker, in Cape Breton and across the province. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Community Services. Mr. Speaker, data we obtained through a Freedom of Information request shows that burnout among social workers in child protection and child, youth and family services has increased 60% since 2013. High levels of poverty in our province have led to large and more complex caseloads for social workers who are on the front lines of supporting children, youth and families. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister of Community Services tell this House how many additional social workers will be hired this year to help address this crisis?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. In fact, Mr. Speaker, what we do know is that our social workers are dealing with a complement of more of what I would say, more complicated cases these days. And so that is taken into account when, in fact, we do look at their caseload. We looked at what their caseload is and what the standards are, and they meet those standards, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
The 2017 survey of Nova Scotia government employees found that only 35% of employees of the Department of Community Services were satisfied with their department, down 12 points from 2015. Only 32% said they felt valued as a Government of Nova Scotia employee, and I can table that. Mr. Speaker, does the Minister of Community Services agree that this
Order,
government's
please. Time allotted for member statements has expired.